So once I feel myself observed by the lens, everything changes. I constitute myself in the process of posing. So much like the three beautiful pieces I have in front of you, what happens is when we see the camera, we change. We're aware of how we look. We're aware of how we construct ourselves. We're aware of how we should be seen. We're aware of the camera, of the lens, of that ability to be frozen in space and in time. So my research works with this quote based by Roland Barthes, and it underscores the common fact that when we are in front of the camera, we pose in a deliberate manner. The act of posing is used by the subject to communicate affection, disdain, support, respect, and friendship. And why I used my muses and friends is because I lacked that time. So posing is also used by the sitter to express or construct self-representation or presentation that is reflective of the subject's values, personality, and mood. So in my research, I am interested in investigating the potential of Roland Barthes' quote for treaties for studies of lunatic asylums. And much like my previous speakers, my research is pyramid, curiosity-based. I have not been killed yet by my research. But it's also based more on questions than answers. For something which is of key importance is when looking at a photograph, there's 1,001 meanings. So this is just one engagement with these photographs, and I hope by opening up the archive to you, the audience, we'll have multiple engagements, multiple interpretations. So specifically, I argue that photographs from the asylum offer us a glimpse or an opportunity to see, or maybe to hermeneutically reconstruct, the patients' voices and their views of the asylum, of institutionalization, and of interpersonal relationships. And this proves to be quite important because the archive is lacking all forms of patients' voices and records. What we do find in the archive is this pervasive presence of the doctor's voice, of concerns, of diagnostic criteria, of symptomology, of illness, of death and decay. But what we don't hear is how the patients respond to this, how we slowly can start to, much in the line of Roy Cort's work, to try and reconstitute what it means when a doctor speaks to a patient. It's a two-way encounter. How do we slowly start to reconstitute it from the patient's perspective? So this hermeneutic exercise is valuable, for it offers the first opportunity for us to engage by looking at these photographs, to maybe look, to view, to see, and to hypothesize what it would mean to be a patient in the 19th century. So at the Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum, like most other 19th century asylums, and this is a photograph from the Walton collection from another international UK-based asylum from the 19th century, is all patients were photographed on admission to the asylum. What I argue is that when we start to look at the photographs from the Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum, roughly about 1890, we slowly start to see that patients were not passive or docile participants in this administrative procedure. Rather, they were active and responded in a number of ways, which could be disregard for an institution. It could also refer to resistance to the clinical and maybe even colonial gaze. What we also see is the first fragments of agents and personhood starting to take place. So unlike the first image that we saw from the international asylums, when we start to look at the South African asylums, the Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum, we see a patient not responding by looking at the camera, not gazing directly, not being submissive and passive, but rather kind of turning herself to the side, rejecting, denying the colonial gaze. And I say colonial and clinical as becoming one of the same in this particular context, for this is an asylum in Africa. So what we slowly start to see is maybe for the first time an act of defiance, something which has been unrecorded previously. But what does it mean for us to slowly start to consider that patients were not passive, that the colonial subject was not passive, but chose to respond in an act of defiance? When we see this next image, which is a spotlight, so I don't know if you can see it, and these photographs are very old, so you can actually see that much like if we don't have a digital culture, we slowly start to see the rejection and the disappearance, the ethereal trace of the photograph disappearing. But if we look at my users behind or at the screen at the back, you can see a photograph of a patient holding a pipe in his hand. This pipe, I see, is not necessarily just an object, but mainly we can slowly start to reconstitute that this pipe actually frames the subject, not as a docile patient, but as mimicking the psychiatrist, kind of looking much like a Freudian reading, but a patient holding a pipe looking just like the doctor himself. So we've got a colonial subject miming the colonizer. Mimicry and performance slowly starts to play out. So mimicry is not just something that we find in hysteria in the 19th century asylums of France, but slowly we can start to see that mimicry, performance, might have been a possibility, might have been possible, engaged with by the colonial subjects in the 19th century South African asylum. What we see in the next image is, or what I'd like to argue from the previous one, is that the performance of the camera might be an important aspect in the analysis of casebook photographs. So we perform when we're in front of the phone and in front of the camera. So what I'd like to argue is that could it not be plausible to consider that the patients adopted certain poses and behavior to receive discharge from the asylum? And in order to offer tentative speculation, I view this image in front of us. The patient, unlike the previous ones, who face the camera head on, or chooses to move away from the camera, reject its gaze, we see a patient smiling, happy. Would we necessarily say that this patient is happy to be in the asylum? Or would we slowly start to consider, if we think about performance, about performativity, that this patient is happy, and within 10 months, and this is a case of entry, he received discharge from the asylum. So what I'm trying to argue in this perspective is that the patient shows an awareness of the silent operations. Patients who comply to the rules and show markers of health, who cooperate with authorities, receive discharge. So this patient is happy. This patient is ready to work. And he is now applying for discharge. He's cheerful, works well, and is intelligent in conversation. So these are usually markers that we see to frame the patient as a docile laborer or colonial subject, docile and happy to work. But I argue, if we look at this photograph, that this patient master was explicitly aware of what it took, what performativity it took to get out of the asylum. In 10 months, unlike most of the records where we look at patients being framed or eternally institutionalized in the asylum records as well as in the asylum, within 10 months, by smiling, by performing a happy, docile figure, we see discharge from the asylum. What the asylum archives are absent about is what it means to have been a patient, how the patient adopted certain interpersonal relationships, how the patient decided or chose to become friends with other individuals, how the patient chose to create and construct a meaningful life of their own within the asylum. So this, again, would offer a tentative speculation, a case of a photograph we see in front of us, but something differs in this case of a photograph. We see a patient holding another patient's hand, a symbol, I argue, of camaraderie, and maybe suggestive of the supportive relationship between patients our patients, chronic patients, created support networks of survival and of living conditions which were not necessarily engaged with by the asylum authorities. What I'd also like to start to view is what would it mean to slowly start to reconsider the asylum in terms of the bonds of solidarity we find within the patients and not the doctor. In the next set of images, this one, the first one, the second one, and the third, we do not see any visual markers of insanity, but idealized images of patients in ways to project a tranquil self-presentation and character. In this image in particular, we see a woman gazing downwards in a modest manner. This modesty is, I would say, underscored again if we look at the sense of the dress as well as the hat. A brooch to cover the neck area, very little skin, which is opened up to the gaze. A modesty, a form of femininity. So what I'd like to argue is that this shows, when we look at this patient, that, or how this patient constructed a self-identity or self-presentation of her own choosing, rather than that of the doctor, is a self-controlled and moderate temperament. In the next image, I find this image very interesting in how the female figure tilts her head in a very poignant manner, how her hair is loose and rolls through curls down her neck, how her dress and her hat seem to be summery and reveal like springtime, or it sounds like quoting Lana Del Rey's Summertime Sadness. So it feels like, in a sense, it's open to a summery picnic. But, so what I would like to argue is that this image represents a tranquil and untroubled temperament, a harmonious character. When we look at the last image, what we see is not necessarily unlike the first two, where we see norms of femininity. What we see is a very confident character. In the 1890s, a white blouse was seen to refer or to reflect an independent lifestyle. For the first time with the blouse, a woman had the opportunity to be free for leisurely activities and also to enter the workplace, rather than being confined and constricted by a Victorian heavy dress. So this woman is free, she's confident, she has a lifestyle, she was a teacher. She was actually quite, in terms of, if we read the casebook notes, she was quite prestigious. She was independent. She was a lone figure or ranger from the UK coming into South Africa to teach English. She had a master's degree. She was confident and independent. But what slowly starts to happen is when we compare the photographs to the casebook entries, we start to see a deep fissure between the two. And this is where I'd like to argue that when we look at the casebook photographs, we see the patient constructing their own identity, framing themselves in their own terms, rather than as a clinical subject, rather than a subject of disease or clinical case of diagnosis. What we rather see is an independence. We also see individuality. So in this image where we see a so-called modest temperament, the doctors actually describe her as having a silly look, covers her face with hands, laughs and giggles in a silly way. So could we argue that in this enactment before the camera, what could it be that the patients are dismissing, maybe deconstructing the authority of the text? For slowly what we start to see is if the image represents reality. This reality that we see in the image is completely different to the casebook entry. How does this realign us in interpreting images? Do we so slowly or solely look at the casebooks, or do we slowly start to see that maybe the casebooks are actually inherently biased, that they are not neutral, that they are not objective? And slowly we need to start repositioning the scales and putting the balance of the patient back in order. What does it mean then to see the patient, to hear the patient's voices in the absence of written text? In the next image, we see the summary for my summertime sadness patient as a tranquil and harmonious character. Instead, the doctor said a dull, heavy expression, irritable, violent, and hysterical. Complete dissonance between the casebook entry and the photograph. Where do we start? How do we start to reconsider our engagement with the asylum? Is it 100% with the doctor? Or do we slowly start to second guess? And how does this curiosity, how do these problems or concerns slowly start to see us reconfigure our own relationships to text and image? And in the last image, a confident individual, independent. The doctor said, anxious, disheveled, and a suspicious look. So what happens then? How do we reconsider? So I would like to be, in a sense, postmodern and say that this destabilizes the relationship between text and image. But I think for the patients, this was a subtle form of showing, reviewing, or of asserting, or of adopting an idealized self to assert claims to subjectivity and personhood, of an identity that transcends the casebook records, which consign the patients to the status of a clinical case to be classified, described, and compared to other cases. Thank you.